Well, there are other issues also that intersect in this discussion that are also challenging.
Thank you. I'm out of time.
Thank you very much. Senator Luján.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to our ranking member for this hearing. And Mr. Secretary, thank you and your team for being here today as well and the work that you've been doing. Madam Secretary, Madam Chair, I also want to say thank you to Brendan and Kyle for coming out to New Mexico. I appreciate them traveling across the country and taking time to see firsthand. They know what an Niseka is now. I want to get them out there with some shovels, and they're going to clean one of these days.
Okay.
But we had them out there as well, and I hope they enjoyed it. I know they both got a little bit of chili.
I know they did.
So I apologize for whatever that may have done to them. But they got a little taste of New Mexico, so just thank you for that.
Well, so pleased to be able to support that.
I appreciate that, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, one issue I wanted to highlight is related to a study the USDA recently released highlighting the discrepancy in farm payments from Hispanic and non-Hispanic farmers. The study also showed that Hispanic farmers are more likely to be at financial risk than their counterparts. And I've been calling for more data on ethnic and racial disparities, and I was glad to finally see USDA release this report. And Mr. Secretary, I just wanted to ask if I have your continued commitment to make equity a priority at USDA.
Absolutely.
I can't thank you enough. And, you know, one of the most recent visits you had, you went out to New Mexico firsthand yourself, which I can't thank you enough, because it's one thing to be able to hear about what's happening on the ground. It's another thing to see it for yourself. And you took time to visit with some of those families who are devastated by what is our largest fire in our state's history. Now, as I've mentioned several times in committee, New Mexico is still recovering from this devastating fire back in 2022. And I appreciate the partnership between FEMA and USDA, some of which you addressed while you were there. But there's still some areas that need some attention, Mr. Secretary. While USDA and FEMA have created a one-of-a-kind conservation restoration plan to help the folks back at home, there's still some additional direction that I think we could benefit from with working with NRCS in New Mexico. And what I still hear from New Mexicans is about some of the confusing guidance coming from NRCS on these plans. In addition, there's also confusion as to how New Mexicans should then apply for other USDA programs. Now, my question, Secretary Vilsack, is can USDA do more to help New Mexicans recover from these fires?
Well, it sounds like we do. We recently allocated additional resources from a disaster fund to create additional resources available to New Mexico, to Vermont, and also to Alaska. But if there are issues relative to NRCS, I'm more than happy to reach out to Chief Crosby and make sure that we're paying attention to whatever the issues are and reducing whatever barriers that exist.
I appreciate that, Secretary Vilsack. As a matter of fact, Madam Chair, one of the visits with Kyle and Brandon was at one of those acequia gates with a local farmer that was impacted by the fires. And he had a few issues that he raised. And Mr. Secretary, I'll submit those in writing so we can just make sure that we're working with the team to get a response to those so that I can help Max better understand how to take advantage of those specific programs. Mr. Secretary, going forward, how does the department plan to implement the lessons it's learned from the recovery efforts in New Mexico into policy and practices? And the reason I ask that question is, to me, there's been this revelation when there's fire disaster across America, and in this case, in forest areas, whether it's FEMA or the federal government as a whole, will react to that fire, but then some of the flooding or some of the other aspects of that disaster that need to be included in some of these declarations. And then all the alphabet soup of the acronyms of every one of these agencies that has a responsibility to work with families in New Mexico. This is really one of the first. It's very unique, but I think there's some practices that maybe we learned here. And so what I'm looking to see is there a way that we can work together to ensure that if this happens anywhere else in the country, that some of these lessons learned from these families on the ground there, the leaders within USDA, that we can capture those and include them in policy?
I think so. I think one of the things we learned was the necessity of having a central location where all of our people are in one place at one time, available to talk to folks who have a variety of different issues depending upon the nature of the disaster and how it may have impacted their particular farm, their home, their community. We did this in a gymnasium, I believe, in New Mexico. I think we learned a lot from that particular experience, and I think we ought to be figuring out how to make that sort of a standard practice in response to disasters.
I appreciate that very much. One of the areas related to this particular fire in New Mexico, as you know, Mr. Secretary, with some of the reports and investigations that have been conducted, some of the prescribed burns weren't put out completely. As a matter of fact, on one of the investigations, I believe the folks that were looking at it put their hands over and said, well, it's not hot, but they didn't use some of the infrared technology that is available to ensure that something is put out completely. And the question that I have, Mr. Secretary, is USDA now moving more aggressively to ensure when there are prescribed burns or other fires that got started, but when we're putting them out, that technology like infrared technology is being used to ensure that it's out completely and that it doesn't have a chance of spreading?
Again, another lesson learned from this is to basically have a much more extensive plan and thought process behind the prescribed burn, using all of the tools and technologies to ensure that it's safe and that it doesn't do the damage that we've seen in New Mexico. So yes, that's happening.
I appreciate that, Secretary Vilsack. And the last thing that I'll touch on, and I know you've heard this from a lot of our colleagues, is the importance of making sure that people that need to get food, that are hungry, that they're able to get that food with some of these supplemental nutrition assistance programs as well, and the conversations that are taking place with all of us here, but especially around kids. I think that we all agree, Democrats, Republicans, when we're talking about the most vulnerable in our communities, and especially hungry kids, there's more that we can do to work together. And so, Secretary Vilsack, yes or no, will the recent updates to the Thrifty Food Plan help combat child poverty?
Well, I think it did. I think there's obviously more to do. I think the summer feeding program is also going to have a positive impact on child hunger and child poverty. You know, the good news, as I mentioned earlier, is that in rural areas, for the first time in a while, we actually saw a reduction in the number of persistently poor counties in this country. We've actually, for the first time in over a decade, we've seen a population increase in rural America. So I think things are beginning to slowly improve. But obviously, there's a lot more work to do.
I thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you. Thank you for being here today. I'm going to follow up a little here on what my colleague, Senator